features another tangled tale of generational curses. So what all of these homes have in common is that they are sites of wealth and privilege. And that's generally the first sign that it might be a haunted house. Here we go. But I do have a question, and that is, can a house be haunted without ghosts? Yes, I argue yes, that it can be if you think about haunting as affect. Ruth Heholt's definition of haunting explains what I mean. She writes, "It is the feeling that counts, even if the belief is lacking. Being haunted is to feel the hairs on the back of your neck rising. It is something glimpsed, but not quite seen from the corner of your eye, a slight misgiving in the pit of your stomach, a delicate rash of goosebumps rising on the cooling skin." So Ruth Heholt is tying the sensation of haunting to affect. And in one of the readings that I chose for this session, the H.G. Wells reading, The Red Room, you can see that happening where the narrator says that, okay, there's nothing here, but I'm so afraid. And he later says, I never did see a ghost, but I was very scared. What was haunting that room was fear. So Shirley Jackson drew on this affective sense of haunting when she came across this photograph during her research for Hill House. She was struck by its air of disease and decay. She wrote, "If ever a house looked like a candidate for a ghost, it was this one." Coincidentally, this house was designed by Jackson's great-great-grandfather, Samuel Charles Bugbee, in the 1870s, and it's called the Crocker House. And I've included a quote here from Shirley Jackson, which I think further emphasizes that relationship between haunting, affect, and architecture. She writes, "The house is the haunting. It can never be unhaunted. You cannot exorcise the ghost from the house because it is the house itself that is doing the haunting." So when Shirley Jackson received this photograph, she asked her mother about it, and her mother replied, "I'm glad it didn't survive the earthquake. It was just considered to be a terrible house and that everyone was better for it being gone, effaced from the street." Another house she drew heavily upon is pictured here. This is the Winchester House in San Jose, California. And the quote that I have is something that Shirley Jackson was writing in a letter as she was planning Hill House. She wrote, "All the old New England houses are the kind of square classical types which wouldn't be haunted in a million years. I have half a dozen sketches of California houses which look right, but remember the Winchester House as a good type house for haunting." So this house, for some historical background, it was built by a reclusive widow, Sarah Winchester, in 1888. And she continued to build it until her death in 1922. Now, soon after her death, it was bought by a John Brown, and he opened it as a tourist attraction. One of the first visitors to the house, Ruth Ament for the San Jose Mercury Herald, wrote that the rooms made her feel queer, left her with an overwhelming impression of confusion and inaccuracy. And she said that the house isn't quite right. Another reporter, about 2 decades later, visits the house, and he writes, "No ghost could be more haunting than the house itself. Frightening because of the 160 rooms, the 10,000 doors and windows, the incoherent jumble of stairways, levels, and rooftops, from an architectural portrait of an unusual mind." The Winchester House is still open to visitors today, and it's marketed as one of the most haunted houses in America. The source of haunting is unsubstantiated, but it did encourage this interesting tale. The tale is that the widow was advised to keep building to outrun the ghosts that haunt her. So now I want to explore a little bit more in depth some of the architecture that elicits such strong feelings that I call haunting architecture. And we're going to start with High Victorian Gothic. Generally became kind of a style of building in the 1850s and 1860s. In Britain, this was considered a muscular style that features polychromy, or that striated appearance, which you can't quite see from the black and white photos, but they are different colored bricks. And I've included Eddington Park again, and there's another hint that Robert Wise was scouting it as a location for his 1963 The Haunting, which is his film adaptation of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. He sees it and says, a pretty horrifying looking thing this is, and that's where he's deciding to film. As far as Eaton Hall, Cheshire, I've seen this picture a few times, and I tried to look into if it was haunted, and I didn't find any stories of that. But despite that, I can't believe it's not haunted. That's what I kept saying every time I saw it. And so these 19th century High Victorian Gothic homes, they've been described as monstrous by architectural historians, architectural critics, and architects. Famous names such as Nicholas Pevsner has called it monstrous. John Summerson said it was provoking utter revulsion. Kenneth Clark said that they're monsters, unsightly wrecks stranded upon the mud flat of Victorian taste, that they're painful to look at. I mean, they did not spare any words or descriptions talking about how utterly disgusting they found this architecture. In fact, this is a poem written by a Victorian. He was writing it in 1868. It's a very, very long poem where he just writes about everything from his breakfast to the news to people's clothing. And he included this bit on architecture. So I'm going to read out a little bit of this to you. A pestilent new style affrights the sun, all angles, ornaments, and irregularities. Top-heavy chimneys threaten to overwhelm me. These acute angles agonize me acutely. They pierce remorselessly into my flesh, and so on and so forth. I don't think it's the most beautiful poem, but I've included it here today because I think it's a good example of a Victorian themselves being quite afraid of this Victorian architecture, because a lot of people, when they think about houses, they say, well, maybe we think Victorian architecture is creepy because it's a past style. But this goes to show that even as they were being built, there were people who were writing in quite a Gothic mode about this architecture. And moving on to a different iteration of Victorian architecture, the Queen Anne style, which Shirley Jackson describes as big old California gingerbread houses. This is considered to be an architectural cocktail. It's got steeply pitched roofs, gables, ornamental chimneys, bay windows, elements of 17th and 18th century English and Dutch architecture composed with the asymmetry and eccentricity introduced by the High Victorian Gothic. You could consider them to be a bit whimsical. So I've included some images of MPhil mansions in San Francisco, and these were along the same street as that Crocker house I showed you before. And we also have the Carson House, which is one of the most photographed houses in the United States, and I showed it here in all of its glory. I've also included a few more examples of Queen Anne houses. So we have an example from Arizona and one from Texas. And coincidentally, they just happen to be considered the most haunted houses in their states, respectively. And now we're going to dive into these houses. We've looked at the facade, and now I want to take our attention into the interiors. So these are the interiors of Harlaxton Manor in Lincolnshire. And I just want us to take a minute to kind of soak in what this is. What strikes me is that this seems to kind of evoke a sense of claustrophobia and agoraphobia simultaneously. There is the sense of being overwhelmed by the space of it all, and also the sense of being enclosed by just such massing of ornament. And it does seem to loom over you. And there's also that exhaustion that as you're in that space, your eye doesn't really have anywhere to turn to and relax. On top of that, if you were feeling a little creeped out or scared, you wouldn't really be sure that everywhere you were looking, your coast is clear, because you never know what's lurking behind one of those, enclaves. For example, something could always just be poking out, kind of hidden in plain sight. But this was considered very fashionable during the time. So, a sprawling Victorian mansion or country house, its many staircases, corridors, turrets, and towers can cause disorientation for its visitors. Moreover, as a symbol of a rigid hierarchical society with strictures on gender, class, and race relations, it can also cause an oppressive psychological reaction. And so I've included this floor plan, which even just on the screen is quite overwhelming. And the reason for that is because it was abiding to two guiding principles of Victorian house design. Now, the first is the specialization of rooms. So ideally, you wouldn't have a multi-purpose room. You would have one room per one activity, one room designated for one thing. And as you can see, that really multiplies the number of rooms that you need in your house. And the second guiding principle of Victorian house design is privacy. So you've got a lot of people with access to this very large home, and you need to find ways to regulate the amount of people and them kind of mingling with each other. So you want to limit mixing of sexes and classes, and you kind of need to keep servants separate from guests, separate from owners. And you can kind of see this in the floor plans that there is a special side, a special wing for children. So you have a nursery corridor and day nursery, night nursery. You've got a women's servants corridor, but that's different from the housekeeper's corridor. You have a butler's wing as well. And the gentlemen servants were actually housed in a different wing entirely. So I included this quote from architectural historian Marc Girard, who is basically remarking of Victorian country houses in general, that unless they're arranged with skill, they could become a warren of confused corridors, dark corners, and innumerable staircases. And this is yet another floor from that same house. And I included this next quote because I thought that it was quite ominous language from an architectural historian. He wasn't trying to write about whether Victorian houses are haunted or not, but this is just the kind of language that these houses inspired. And I thought that it is echoed then when people are looking at haunted houses, they kind of mirror that language of like, oh, it's very large, it's excessive, it's got a lot of corridors and excess of doors and rooms. So, and then lastly, I have that kind of lineage from, an architectural historian to Shirley Jackson herself. I've included a quote from Dr. Montague, who's asking, have you not wondered at our extreme difficulty in finding our way around? And so there is that aspect of losing yourself in this house. Or if you're trying to get away from something, you may run down the wrong corridor and hit a dead end. Or alternatively, you think you're safe in a room, but you don't realize that there's actually access to the room from a different side. And so there's that sense of being exposed to risk, but also being trapped. And I think that's what's just so very affectively frightening about a Victorian floor plan. But I'm going to move on now to Horror Victorianorum. which was coined by philosopher David Stove, and his description of a reaction to Victoriana in the 1930s. He describes it as a sensation of darkness, stillness, enclosure, and above all, of weight or pressure. Some indefinite but massive incubus is pressing down on us, and we are about to suffocate. For God's sake, let the air in and me out is the most prominent element and the sufferer's reaction. And I included this image because I thought it encapsulated that feeling quite well. You'll notice that every single surface from floor to ceiling is covered or decorated. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of clutter. It's very hard for the eye to really zero in on what is going on. So household manuals actually encouraged this practice of covering every surface, especially the use of draperies. They went so far as to say, okay, well, you can put draperies on your windows to limit light. You can put draperies around your doors to limit privacy and to encourage privacy and limit drafts. But they also encouraged putting drapes on any sharp corners of the furniture or otherwise, or blank spaces of wall. They thought that that was cozy. So that's what a lot of people did, resulting in interiors like this one and the one in the next slide. But what I've included here are two quotes. We've got Virginia Woolf, who in Orlando was mentioning that gloomy Victorian atmosphere and the idea of purple plush. And then Shirley Jackson, oddly enough, she picks up on purple plush too, and that's what one of her characters says when she's describing Hill House. And I think it's very interesting how these kind of sensations of cosseted purple plush is something that's getting carried down through generations of authors. So we come here to just more examples of Victorian clutter. There's a relatively restrained example of the drapery that I'm talking about, and it's quite heavy. And Victorians, they had a lot of wallpaper going on, so much so that it would inspire Charlotte Perkins Gilman to write The Yellow Wallpaper in 1898. But it wasn't just short story authors who were writing about wallpapers. Household guides actually talked about how ugly they were, how gloomy an atmosphere that they created, how uncomfortable it was. And an architect in 1904 said, "Don't we all know the terror of being ill when a pretentious and hideously beflowered wallpaper meets the eye on every side?" Again, there's that kind of relationship between architects and interior designers making offhand comments, and then someone like Charlotte Perkins Gilman writing about it in a short story. But then electricity comes in to the home, and Victorian interiors are seen in a new light. The color palette becomes more soft and becomes lighter. Simplified floor plans emerge for easier installation of electricity and plumbing to more people, and dirt and dust becomes easier to see as well. So there's this book by Eileen Clare called Victorian Dust Traps, which is fascinating. And she talks about how by the end of the Victorian era, people were noticing that nooks, crannies, tunnels, dark rooms, narrow hallways, turrets, cherished by Gothic revivalists, they were harboring a lot of dust. And so they were considered unsightly, but also unsanitary. So I've included here a couple of examples of seeing that Victorian parlor reemerge in Gothic horror in the 20th century. On the top, we've got The Haunting of Hill House. You'll notice that it's quite a striking similarity to the images that I showed you before. And on the bottom, we have Mother's Bedroom from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. And if you've ever read the book Psycho by Robert Bloch, or if you've seen the movie, you'll notice that there's quite an emphasis on the kind of gloomy, looming Victorian aesthetic. But right now, I do want to talk about corridors. And I'm a huge fan of Roger Luckhurst's corridor Gothic. So this is definitely, inspired by that. But I did have some thoughts on corridors, especially corridors in Hill House. So why does so much of the troubling, if not outright supernatural phenomena occur predominantly in corridors? For example, on the second night that the guests are at Hill House, Eleanor and Theodora hear thunderous hammering along the corridor outside their bedrooms, accompanied by an intense cold. They have to hope that the door stays closed to keep them relatively safe. And on her last night in Hill House and her last night alive, Eleanor wanders along the corridors, and she's the one who's hammering on the doors. And maybe there's something to that, because now she's seemingly possessed by the house. She's one with the house, so she's that force in the corridors. And I just think that it's quite interesting, because if Hill House was a malevolent entity, as Jackson implies it is, in its entirety, the bedroom should offer no refuge from whatever is haunting the corridors. I mean, that incorporeal force should just be able to go in and out at will, instead of being, blocked by something physical as a door. So, I'm just wondering why the two characters feel so safe in the bedroom. And I think that, as Roger Luckhurst mentioned, since the introduction of corridors into the home, they've symbolized a locus of anxiety and liminality, and they serve as an instrument of organization, segregation, and controlled access. Going back to what I was saying before about 19th century floor plans and that tension between giving people space and access to things, but also trying to maintain as much privacy as possible. Now, I'm just going to move on really quick to identify some of the interiors that I mentioned previously. You see them here beautifully reproduced in Crimson Peak. And just briefly, because I'm sure you've seen examples like this before, we've kind of have this silhouette, this haunted house trope going on throughout the 20th century, which you can see from the Addams Family and Bates House. It's that Queen Anne mansard roof, kind of almost Second Empire thing that I was talking about. It's kind of odd and tall, asymmetrical, and angular. And so we just kind of see this carbon copy start to proliferate, starting in the United States. And then we see it also being adapted in British media as well. But then moving us along swiftly to the 21st century, we have some examples here of houses that are in American media, but they kind of keep that British country house aesthetic. And it is still very much Victorian, if not authentically so. It's at least Victorian inspired. We have, the turrets, the chimneys, again with asymmetry and kind of gloomy, heavy interiors. And lastly, The Shining. So what does The Shining have to do with this? Well, a few things. First of all, when Stephen King wrote his novel, he was very much inspired by Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. He even mentions it a few times throughout the book. And his description of the Overlook Hotel is not quite as detailed as Shirley Jackson's, but he does allude to it being old-fashioned. And we have to assume old-fashioned means turn of the century, Victorian-esque. Stanley Kubrick gets rid of all of that. And you would say, okay, this is quite a modernist approach. However, I still think that the Overlook has some Victorian characteristics, especially in its floor plan, its corridors, its many rooms, its confusing and intricate layout. So I still think that it does serve as like a kind of Victorian inspired, Victorian country house inspired horror film. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Gothica, for having me speak, and congratulations to your 5th year running.